My brother called me at 2:17 in the morning from an emergency room payphone. He had my number saved. That told me something. 5 years ago, he stood in our parents' living room and told a lie so precise and so calm that I spent 3 days questioning my own memory. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry. He presented his version of events the way someone presents a receipt, with the quiet confidence of a person who knows the numbers add up. Tonight, with machines beeping somewhere behind him and his voice barely holding together, he needed me to be the only person who knew what had actually happened. I almost didn't answer. I want you to know that. I was in bed. It was dark. His name on the screen felt like a word from another language, one I used to speak and had deliberately forgotten. I lay there through the first ring, the second, and somewhere in the third I picked up. Not because I had forgiven him, not because I was ready. I picked up because I had spent 5 years preparing for a moment I couldn't predict. And something in my chest said, "This is it. Let me tell you who I was before the lie, so you understand what it cost. I'm the older of 2 children. My brother Callum is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, we weren't enemies. We were just different. I was quieter. He was the one who filled a room. My parents loved us both, I believe that, but they understood Callum in a way that came more easily. He knew how to be what they needed in any given moment. I tended to say what I actually thought, which is a quality that looks like confidence but functions, in certain families, like sandpaper. I was 26 when everything changed. I'm 29 now. 3 years of building the life I had before, and then 2 more years of learning that the life I had before wasn't entirely worth rebuilding. By the night of that phone call, I lived in a 1-bedroom flat 2 hours from my hometown. I had a job I was good at, a small circle of friends who knew me as a person rather than a role, and a habit of contentment that had taken genuine effort to develop. I had not spoken to my parents in 5 years. I had not spoken to Callum in 5 years. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and false to describe those 5 years as pure suffering. There were hard months. There was a period in year 2 where I checked my phone on my mother's birthday, as if a message might appear. And when it didn't, I sat with that for a long time. There was a night I ordered the cake my mother always made for celebrations. Lemon drizzle. Very simple. At a cafe by myself because I needed to mark the day somehow. And that was the only way I knew how. But there was also a life, a real one. Incrementally, honestly built. What I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my therapist, not a single person, was that 3 years into the silence, I received a message I never opened. Her name was Maya. We'd been friends since secondary school, close enough that she knew my family, knew Callum, had been at enough dinners and holidays to understand the architecture of how we all fit together. After the cutoff, she stayed in touch with me, but she was careful. She didn't take sides out loud. She was the kind of person who observes more than she speaks, which is why, when she sent me a message on a Thursday afternoon in February 3 years ago, I should have paid closer attention. The message said, "I think you should see this. No pressure, but I think you should." Attached was a screenshot thread, a conversation between Callum and someone I didn't immediately recognize, a mutual friend of theirs, I gathered. From the context, I opened the message. I read 2 lines, and then I closed it. I want you to understand why. I was in a good place by then. I had spent 2 years carefully removing the weight of what had happened, and I was not willing to pick it back up without a reason. I told myself I would look at it when I was ready. When it mattered, I wasn't avoiding the truth. I was choosing when to let it back in. I archived the message, and I didn't look at it again for 3 years. Now let me go back, because you need to know what the lie actually was. 5 years ago, my mother noticed that small amounts of money had been leaving her personal account over several months. Not dramatic sums, and 40 pounds here, 60 pounds there. Enough to notice, not enough to immediately alarm. She mentioned it to my father. My father mentioned it to Callum, and Callum, I now understand, had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. He came to me first. Not to accuse me. He came as a concerned brother, asking if I knew anything, suggesting gently that Mum was confused, that she might want to check her statements. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. He nodded. He seemed to accept that. 3 days later, he sat down with my parents at the dinner table and told them he had looked into it. He said the withdrawals corresponded to dates when I had visited. He said he had spoken to me and I had seemed evasive. He said, and this is the part that landed, that he didn't want to believe it either, but that he cared too much about the family to stay quiet. He had no proof. There was no proof because it hadn't happened, but he presented it the way he presented everything, with a calm and a sorrow that read as reluctance. As if the truth were costing him something. My mother had recognized a pattern. The dates did correspond to my visits. The problem was that the withdrawals were something she had made herself, for reasons she had forgotten in the way that we sometimes forget things we've done 100 times. Petty cash, small expenses, a running arrangement with herself she'd let slip her mind. Callum knew about this. He had observed enough, over enough years, to understand that her memory for small transactions was unreliable. He didn't plant evidence. He just planted doubt in exactly the right soil. My parents asked me to explain myself. I told them I hadn't taken anything. They told me that Callum had no reason to. And in that sentence, delivered by my father in a voice I had never heard before, level, decided, closed, I understood that the conversation was already over. I was asked to leave. I went. I didn't beg, didn't scream, didn't make a scene they could reframe later as instability. I took my coat from the hook by the door, the one I'd hung there 1,000 times, and I left. I didn't know, walking to my car that night, that it would be 5 years before I heard my brother's voice again. The silence settled quickly, the way deep cold does, not all at once but steadily, until it had reached everything. There were no official announcements. No family meeting where sides were declared. My parents simply stopped calling. When I called them, conversations were short and pointed, and within 6 months they stopped entirely. I learned, through a cousin who tried to stay neutral, that my parents had told the extended family I had hurt them and refused to apologize. Since I had, in fact, refused to apologize for something I hadn't done, I suppose that was technically accurate. Callum, by all accounts, remained present. The good son, the reliable one, the one who showed up. I built my life in the other direction. I moved cities at the end of year 1, got a better job, made friends who had no context for any of this, which was, for a long time, the greatest relief of my adult life. I ran 3 times a week. I read more than I ever had. I called Maya on her birthday every year, and we talked about everything except the thing between us. The archived message, the unopened thread, the things she had sent and I had not acknowledged. She never pushed. That was the kindest thing she ever did for me. The call came on a Wednesday night, technically Thursday. Morning, I had been asleep for 2 hours. His name on the screen. I answered on the 3rd ring. "It's me," he said. Unnecessary. I knew. His voice was thin in a way I had never heard from him. Callum had always sounded like someone who knew what to do next. This was a different register entirely. Smaller, stripped of its usual architecture. He told me he was in hospital. A collapsed lung, spontaneous apparently, the kind that can happen without injury, without warning. He was stable. He was going to be fine. But they were keeping him overnight and possibly longer, and he was alone in a corridor with a payphone, and he had called me, not our parents. Me. I asked him why. There was a pause. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "I don't know why I called you. I needed to talk to someone who knew me before I became whatever I am now." I sat up in the dark. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I'll come." It takes 2 hours to drive from my flat to that hospital. I know because I've made the journey to that town before, though never to that building. I drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. No music, no podcasts, just the road and the dark and the strange suspended feeling of doing something I had not planned. And then, somewhere on the motorway with the orange light strobing past the windscreen, I thought about Maya's message. I don't know what made me think of it at that precise moment. Perhaps it was the sense that whatever I was driving towards required me to know everything I actually knew. Perhaps it was that Callum's voice on the phone, who I was before I became whatever I am now, had unlocked something I'd been keeping sealed. At the next service station, I pulled in. I opened my archived messages. I found the thread from Maya, 3 years old. The preview still showing those first 2 lines I had read and then retreated from. I opened it fully this time. And I read the whole thing. It was a conversation between Callum and a friend of his, someone named Daniel, who I knew vaguely, who had been in Callum's social orbit since university. The thread was dated 5 weeks before the dinner. Before the accusation, before any of it. In the messages, Callum was not confessing. He wasn't gloating. He was, and this is the part that stayed with me, standing at a service station at 3 a.m. under fluorescent light. He was workshopping. He was asking Daniel how to frame something. He described the situation. The money Mom had been withdrawing without telling Dad. He said it could look bad if someone wanted it to. He asked which version would be more believable, that I had done it impulsively or that it had been a pattern. He talked about timing, about which details to lead with, about how to appear reluctant. Daniel, to his credit, said, "Mate, I don't think you should do this." Callum replied, "I'm not going to do anything. I'm just thinking." The thread ended there. He was just thinking. 5 weeks later, he delivered the lie to my parents at the dinner table, and I lost my family. I sat in my car in that service station car park for a long time. Not crying, not angry, just very, very still. The way you go still when something you always knew becomes something you can prove. Then I started the car and I kept driving. I found him in a side room off the main ward. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps the hospital bed had that effect on everyone, I don't know. He had a tube in his hand, a monitor clipped to his finger, and the particular expression of someone who has been frightened and is now embarrassed about having been frightened. He looked at me. Looked at him? "You came," he said. I said I would. I sat down in the chair beside the bed. We were quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of 2 people who have 5 years of unsaid things stacked between them and no agreed-upon way to begin. He asked me how I was. I told him fine. I asked him how he felt. He said better than 2 hours ago. We talked about nothing for a while. The ward, the drive, the weather on the motorway. The kind of conversation that isn't a conversation but is necessary, like clearing a table before you can put anything on it. Then I said, "Do you remember Maya?" He looked at me carefully. "Yeah, of course. She sent me a message 3 years ago. A screenshot thread. Between you and Daniel." His face didn't collapse. It just shifted. A small movement, barely visible, like something beneath the surface adjusting its weight. "I never opened it," I said. "Until tonight. On the way here." He was quiet. "Why?" I asked. Not with anger, genuinely. It was the only question I'd ever really wanted answered. Not what he had done. I had always known what he had done. Just why. He looked at the window. There was nothing to see. It was black outside, the glass just a mirror at that hour. I panicked, he said finally. Mom and Dad were talking about updating the will, dividing things properly, and I'd made a mess of my finances, and I was scared of what a proper accounting of everything would show. And then the thing with Mom's account came up, and it was there. It was a door I didn't have to build. I just had to open it. "And walk me through it," I said. "And walk you through it," he said. Very quietly, not as agreement. As acknowledgement, I let the silence sit. I told myself it was temporary, he said. That I'd fix it. That I'd find a way to undo it without... He stopped. There wasn't a way. Once they believed it, anything I said to correct it just looked like guilt. And then a week became a month, and a month became a year. And at some point it had been so long that opening it felt like destroying everything all over again, just in a different direction. "So you kept it," I said. I kept it. I looked at him in the hospital bed. He was 32 years old, and he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his lung. I reached into my bag, took out my phone, opened the archived thread, set it on the bed beside him so he could see it. That's what I know, I said. I'm not going to use it to hurt you. I'm not going to send it to anyone. But I need you to understand that I am not the person you told them I was. And I never was. He looked at the screen for a long time. I know, he said. They don't. He looked up at me. I said, you called me first tonight. Not them. Me. I've been thinking about that the whole drive here. And I think it means that some part of you already knows you can't live inside this story for another 5 years. I'm not going to make that decision for you. But I'm telling you, the door is there. You built it. You can open it. He didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the window. Still nothing but his own reflection and mine behind him. Then he said, will you stay? While I call them? Yes, I said. Okay, he said, and he picked up his phone. My parents arrived 40 minutes later. I stood in the corridor while they went in. I could not hear the words through the door. I heard the rhythm of it, the way conversations rise and fall and stop and start, when something important is being transferred from one person to another. At one point it went very quiet for a long time. I don't know what that silence held. Some moments belong only to the people inside them. My father came out first. He stood in the corridor beside me and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. He is not a man who reaches for words easily, which I had always understood as coldness when I was younger, and understand now simply as his particular shape. He said, I owe you, I said. Not tonight. He nodded. We stood there together in the corridor until a nurse came through and we both stepped aside to let her pass. And then we were just two people standing in a hospital at 4 a.m, which is perhaps the most leveling place in the world. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. I didn't move away. I drove home as the sun was coming up. The motorway was pale and quiet. I stopped at the same service station on the way back. I'm not entirely sure why. I sat in the car park for a few minutes with a coffee I'd bought from a machine. That tasted like nothing in particular. I thought about the message I had archived for 3 years, and the reason I had finally opened it. I hadn't been ready before. That's the simple truth of it. I had needed to be somewhere stable enough that the truth couldn't knock me over. And then I'd needed the right moment. And the moment had found me on a motorway at 3 a.m. because my brother called me from a payphone. He called me first. I used to think there was something strange in that. Some angle I was missing. Now I think it was the most honest thing he'd done in 5 years. That somewhere beneath everything he had built and maintained and protected, there was still a part of him that knew exactly who had the truth, and he called her. In the weeks that followed, my parents and I spoke on the phone, slowly, carefully, with the particular attention of people who are aware that they are handling something that has been damaged and is not yet sure whether it can hold weight. My mother cried during our first call. I didn't ask her not to. I didn't comfort her extravagantly either. I just stayed on the line, which was what she needed. My father was more formal, more careful. He gave me a version of an apology that was not quite the one I might have written for him, but it was genuine, and I have learned that genuine is what matters, not perfect. Callum and I did not speak again for several weeks after the hospital. When we did, it was brief and functional and entirely without performance, which is, I think, the only way forward for now. I have not moved back to my hometown. I do not intend to. The life I built in the other direction is real, and it is mine. And I am not willing to fold it away simply because the circumstances that created it have changed. What I have done is leave the door open. On my terms. In my own time. That is enough for now. People sometimes ask, well, they will, once they know this story, why I didn't fight harder at the beginning. Why I didn't immediately demand they look at the evidence, challenge the accusation, refuse to leave until they believed me. The honest answer is that I knew something they didn't, and I chose in that moment to let the truth do its own work rather than force it through a door that was already shut. Was right that the door would open eventually. I was perhaps naive about how long eventually would take. But I have come to believe that certain truths move on their own timescale, and that the job of the person carrying them is not to hurl them at walls, but to keep them safe until the moment. Arrives the moment arrived on a Wednesday night when my brother's name appeared on my screen, and I picked up on the third ring. He called me first. Not because I was convenient, not because I was closest, because he needed, in the most frightened moment of his adult life, to speak to the person who had never stopped telling the truth, even in silence. And that, in the end, was the thing that neither of us had to say out loud. We already knew it. We had always known it.